Being trapped on a runaway train can be a terrifying experience for anyone. You could easily get killed or injured. And often, with how heavy trains can be, once that runaway starts, it's very hard to get it to stop.
I told you that guy. I told you something was up.
Maybe we're on some express run or something.
Wake up, wacko. We just blew the caboose to hell without even slowing down. Something screwy's going on here. Look, all the handrails are going.
One such railroader by the name of Wesley McDonald had such an experience, and it is one he will never forget. On March 9th, 1987, 60-year-old Engineer McDonald was operating Canadian National Work Extra 9548 on the Nepisiguit subdivision. He was going to perform a series of switching maneuvers at the Brunswick mines, where the train was to collect 23 cars. The train consisted of two General Motors diesel GP40-2Ws, numbered 9548 and 9457. These were Canadian builds that were almost identical to the American Electromotive Division GP40-2s, sporting the same build style and prime mover, but with a wide cab instead of the EMD standard cab. To get the cars they needed from the yard at Brunswick Mines, the train was required initially to withdraw a total of 31 cars from the yard, but for the first move they would take 23, or so they thought. Engineer McDonald was alone in the cab of the lead engine, and as instructed, he coupled the engines with the cars in tracks B226, B225, and B224, culminantly in that order. He was then required to initiate a reverse movement back from track 24 toward the yard limit. At the beginning of his backward movement, Engineer McDonald could not be aware of how many cars he was pulling, although it was usual to collect approximately 23 cars. It is common ground that his view was obscured by covered gondola cars coupled to the engines, as well as by the snow, so he would have to rely on communications with Trainman Court via radio, who would be an extra set of eyes for him. Court contacted him on the radio and advised that there were 23 cars in the movement and that the air was not coupled. It is common that in switching cars from one track to another, that a train may generally rely on the brakes of the locomotive, as the cars being switched around are not being hooked up to the air brake system. This was normal practice at Brunswick Mines at the time. When the train is fully assembled, the air hoses are then hooked up so all the cars have their own braking force, and on they would go. In their normal course, therefore, assuming a load of 23 cars, McDonald would not expected any need to couple the air brake system until he had completed assembly of his train. Unbeknownst to the engineer, however, and contrary to the impression he took from whatever Trainman Court may have said, he was in fact pulling 31 cars, all heavily loaded with ore, not 23. He pulled the train back on a downhill grade approximately 23 car lengths from the yard switch, and then applied the full service application on his locomotive's independent brakes. However, to his horror, the train did not slow down. It instead accelerated. At that point, his two locomotives and a substantial number of cars were on a 1.19% downhill grade, and Engineer McDonald realized he was quickly losing control of his train. He then applied the emergency brakes, but they had no effect either. The train continued to accelerate down the hill. The engineer was now the only crew member left aboard the train, the others being in the caboose, which was uncoupled on track 221 in the switching yard.
This is Work Extra 9548 at the Brunswick Mines. Is that you, Alfie?
Yes, go ahead. Over.
Alfie, I think we may have a mayday situation on our hands. We've grabbed a bunch of cars back here at the mines, and we can't hold them. She's away on us there. How's number 14?
14 left fastest at 0818. Over.
Okay, let us know if she's pretty iffy there. Watch my left, might be able to hold her, and she might be right on the main line.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, all right. How many cars is there? Yep, over.
She has a hold of us 30. Don't. All right, there now. 50. She's doing 50, and I got no control of her.
You got no control over Wesley? Are you coupled to those cars? Over. An awful goddamn mix-up if I ever can survive it.
The train then flies down the grade, reaching speeds of over 75 miles an hour. The engineer leaves the cab of the lead engine toward the first car and desperately tries to apply the handbrake on the car, which had no effect. All he could do now was fall back to his second locomotive and just hold on and pray. He also grabbed hold of the train horn valve, blowing the horn at crossings and through towns, warning people of his runaway train. During the 20 minutes of the train's descent, the dispatcher, who stayed in radio contact with Engineer McDonald, was able to warn other trains and work crews of the runaway.
Engine number 14 here. We're behind Nepisiguit now. Yeah, all right. The reason why I'm telling you that is the ore train has a runaway train on the Nepisiguit stop, but he can't get her stopped, and he's heading for Nepisiguit about 50 miles an hour. He lost his air. Over. Okay, we're by there now. Don't worry about that.
He then notified emergency services of the ensuing emergency and to prepare for the worst.
Wesley, is there no way that you can get off of that train? For the love of heavens, over. I can't get off her. Well, I think you better bail off into a snowbank if you can do it at all. Oh, right, I don't know.
The engineer stays on the train instead. It was clear if he was going to go down with his train, he'd go down fighting, trying to see if there was any other way to slow or stop the runaway.
Wesley, are you alone in that engine? Would you repeat that, please? Over. Oh, boy, I don't know. I got around one corner. Robert Dempsey, can you open one of those switches at the Nepisiguit so he can get out of the main line if he can make it, and whatever one you think is the best? Over. No, we never make it to Thatcher. We're about 2 miles from there now. Get the hell away out of the way. Well, get the hell out of the way then, Palmer.
As the train approached the junction of the Newcastle subdivision, the engineer sat on the floor of the cab of the second locomotive, bracing himself for impact.
Hello, Bathurst Station.
EM dispatches, EM Assistant Superintendent, over.
You in Bathurst, sir?
No, I'm in Hamilton. Can you get hold of that train somehow?
No, I can. I'm trying to get a hold of the driver, and he won't answer me now. He was the only one on it, I think. The van is still at the mines. The train broke away.
Yeah, if you can get hold of him, tell him that when he comes to a stop, and hopefully with no injuries or anything, tell him not to move until we're all out there.
Well, then he hit the switch in the busy with about 70 miles an hour, so I don't know where you're going to find him at.
Okay, tell him I don't want anything to move when he comes to a stop.
Well, if he can do that switch of the busy bit, man, I imagine he's at a stop all right in the woods somewhere.
Yeah, well, hopefully not. Send dispatcher Hunkin over.
Yeah, dispatcher Hunkin over.
Yeah, we're coming into west here now. He's off the track. That's right around the shack at the Nepisiguit.
How bad is she out there, do you see?
The locomotives and all 31 cars left the track, doing almost 70 miles an hour at milepost 0.34 on the Nepisiguit subdivision. The engines came to a rest on their side with the hoppers strewn all over the area. Some maintenance men working on the track bed near the derailment saw the train speed by and ran toward the wreck, expecting McDonald to be dead.
Taylor, can you see how badly he is derailed? Over.
I see him dispatcher Bunkman in Road Master Gowden, over.
Yeah, where are you at, Neil?
I'm coming in the Nepisiguit there now. It's not looking very good here.
Can you see the engines?
Yeah, they look to be on their side. I'll get back to you right away here.
Miraculously, Engineer McDonald had survived the violent crash, and he crawls out the second engine. He was clearly shaken and suffering cuts and bruises, but he was lucky to escape with his life. Fortunately, no fire occurred in the engines, despite the fuel tanks being punctured. The cost of the derailment exceeded $1.2 million. Now, how could this happen? As stated before, it's common for switching maneuvers to not require the air hoses being hooked up, especially at the mines. Also, there was no way McDonald would have known he was pulling 31 cars instead of the 23, since there'd be little difference in the acceleration of the train, since the engines had more than enough power to move either number of cars. At first, the brakes were suspected to have failed. However, they were found to be in working order on the engines. CN blamed the engineer, since he took too many cars and did not hook up the air, which was against a bulletin stating all trains switching at the mines must have the air hoses hooked up at all times. However, in an interview with the engineer, he stated had he known he was pulling 31 cars instead of 23, as he was told, he would have never made the reverse move unless the air was hooked up. Despite this, he was still found at fault by the company and was given a 6-month suspension. The other crew members also got similar punishment. However, loads of people did not approve of Engineer McDonald's suspension. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Organizations such as the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers argued the bulletin to have the air brakes hooked up on switching maneuvers at the mine at all times was only put in after the accident, yet still on the same day. It should also be noted that CN and the Canadian Transport Committee were both aware of the practices, but did not act upon them until after the accident. Plus, them not enforcing it earlier to prevent such a runaway would actually make the company itself at fault. They also argued the engineer had over 42 years of service with Canadian National and that he stayed on board the train trying everything he could to stop or slow the train until it hit the curve. The engineer also blew his horn at crossings, warning people of the oncoming train. Even Bathurst Mayor Douglas Williamson opposed the suspension of the engineer, stating, "How could CM be so crass as to suggest his guilt after he risked his life to stay with the locomotive until it derailed?" Other factors include the brakes on the locomotives. The locomotives in question were fitted with composition brakes instead of the traditional cast iron brake shoes, which were known to be problematic. Also, because the locomotives were a slightly older design, they were not equipped with dynamic brakes. Had the locomotives been equipped with dynamic brakes, they likely would have been able to hold on to that grade. 9 months later, the engineer was finally cleared of any fault for the accident, and also had his workers' benefits and pension reinstated, allowing him to peacefully retire not long after on November 1st, 1988. He says he enjoyed the railroad and the company, but just thinks the higher-ups are just not reasonable. Yes, he made a mistake, but the punishment didn't fit the crime. He definitely felt like he was being used as a scapegoat, as CN saw an increase in derailments around that time, including the infamous head-on collision at Hinton just 1 year earlier when a CN manifest with an incapacitated crew slammed head-on into a Via Rail passenger train. That wreck landed CN in very hot water. He's lucky to be alive, but will never forget the most terrifying 20 minutes of his life on that runaway. He has sadly since passed away in 1997. As for the locomotives, both were pulled from the bankment, repaired, and returned to service with CN. 9548 will be sold to the Yadkin Valley Railroad in North Carolina sometime in 2004, until being sold again in 2009 to Knoxville Locomotive Works. Today, the engine is now part of the Lancaster and Chester Railroad of South Carolina. 9457 was sold to Railcar Limited in 2005 until being sold again in 2011 to New England Central, renumbered to 3015, and is still in service as of today. Brunswick Mines would close in April of 2013 after suffering a series of economic ups and downs. 34 years have passed since the incident, and the memories of this harrowing experience will likely stay fresh in several people's minds forever.